All right, so it looks like we've got critical mass. So thank you for joining today's webinar, Achieving Compliance, Cannabis Facility, Environmental Health and Safety Audits, EH&S. Just going to start the acronym soup right now, starting with EHS, and we'll keep it going throughout this webinar. You'll hear many new acronyms. My name is Michelle Bodium. I'm counsel with the law firm Vicente Cedarberg. I am the chair of our environmental health and safety practice among a number of different roles that I do, but that's the primary one for today. And for today's webinar, I'm joined with two great panelists, Casey with our Director of Regulatory Compliance with VS, and Adam, who's a Senior Project Lead with Ensafe. I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves, and then we're going to talk a little bit about exciting things happening between VS and Ensafe. But Casey, if you want to just introduce yourself.
Sure. Casey Lever, as Michelle had said, I'm the Director of Regulatory Compliance for Vicente Cedarberg. In my day-to-day, I help our clients go from, a piece of paper, having a license, to becoming operational, and then, of course, staying operational, which has its, its caveats of different types of compliance, from build-out all the way to, general operations, testing, and things that you experience on the day-to-day.
Great.
Good afternoon, everyone. Adam Weissman. I'm a senior engineer manager with Ensafe, based out of my office is based out of Connecticut. We help clients with a broad variety of issues. Mostly my involvement is on the environmental side. We do a lot of health and safety work, also air permitting, help folks get permits they need to operate, help folks with regulatory reporting. So things of that nature on the EH&S side. Quite a broad range of services and types of clients.
Great. Thank you so much for joining me today. And, we have Adam here from Ensafe. Not by coincidence, Ensafe is, well-respected, well-regarded company within the space. They have over, 370 employees across the country, locations in a variety of states. They do some international work. As Adam said, they do health and safety, civil and design engineering, environmental remediation, just a whole host of all things EH&S. And here at VS, we're very excited to announce that, they are our strategic partners for all things EH&S. So as we're going to get into today about auditing and compliance, but also working with them for remediation and engineering and sustainability. And we, really think they're best in class, and they're going to bring a lot of, institutional knowledge. They've been helping various industries, which Adam will touch on, stay in compliance, get ahead of the curve. And we think they're going to be excellent partners in bringing all of that knowledge and information to the cannabis industry. So today, we're going to kick things off with an overview from Casey about cannabis compliance auditing generally. And then after that, Adam will get in a lot more detail about EH&S, what we've seen in various other industries, what you're likely to see in your cannabis facility in this space today. We're going to leave some time for questioning and back and forth discussion at the end, but that's just the roadmap of what we're going to hear from today. So Casey, if I can turn it to you just broadly to start introducing the concept of auditing. When might you want to do that? Some things to look out for in the cannabis context, and then we'll drill down into EH&S.
Sure. Yeah. Why audit? And of course, that's a big part of, what we do as well with our compliance program here is, you get all open and operational. And one of the important reasons why you audit and why we help with that is because sometimes what I say is like the dust will settle. So you're active, you're up to date. You see something every single day, you walk by it every day. You think, well, this is a part of, our SOP or whatever it may be, but having an outside group come in to audit, or having, somebody identify within your facility to do audits with a fresh set of eyes is hugely important to identify any critical issues. Of course, if you see something, say something. To review documentation for completion. That means different audits. Different logs, different visitor logs, waste disposal logs, even inventory tracking. There should be no blank spaces, right? And addressing issues internally before they escalate into something external, whether that's cannabis regulatory external or other authorities that may need to be involved. And of course, most importantly is staying up to date with regulatory changes and guidance. You know, every state has a different regulatory body and other authorities that are involved that are constantly issuing guidance, whether that's, you know, on websites and written guidance and often in verbal guidance. They will change, you know, enforcement priorities. So it's important to stay on top of those. In a typical cannabis compliance audit, we're looking at everything from on-site sanitation, inventory tracking, your policies and procedures is what is written in your policy procedures, exactly what's happening. Are there issues with what we see happening on site when it comes to regulatory compliance? We do a lot of observing, right? I'm going to watch exactly how you are handling marijuana. You know, is there the right PPE? Does it comply with the regulations when it comes to inventory tracking as well? Storage, huge part of cannabis compliance, whether it's cannabis storage, toxic products, and IPM. And record keeping. You know, you can be doing everything you can operationally, but are you documenting it? Just keeping an eye on that. So for pre-licensure, compliance really starts before you open your doors. Setting yourself up for success with, you know, SOPs, your operational Bible, you know, and they have to be perfect because that's what your team is going to go back to check, am I doing something properly? Then you have to train, of course, to that, providing education to everybody and creating a culture of compliance. It's not one person's job to do compliance, it's everyone at the facility's job. And lastly, you know, in-house versus third-party assistance, you know, building a network of people you can rely on to stay up to date on regulations and general cannabis compliance. So there's obviously post-licensure. So you're finally operational, you've got everything going, you're excited to hit the ground running. You want to, you know, create a team and really empower that team to have conversations about compliance, look into the regulations, look at guidance, and communicate with each other about what's going on, challenge each other sometimes, because that's really important to get, you know, someone new comes in, looks at a regulation different, engage in that conversation. Education. When you're finding things wrong, you need to address them, change SOPs, and do training. Conducting your own internal audits or external audits, and have somebody come in and make sure that everything is done properly, equipment is all operational, documentation is in line, and just develop in-house strategies to get that done, whether that means calendaring these audits or calendaring, you know, just general record keeping deadlines and notification requirements. Another huge part of being operational is your technical support, whether that's inventory tracking, point of sale systems, and other vendors that you could be using to ensure compliance. So you're going to do your best, obviously, to set yourself up for success in compliance. You're going to get operational. You're going to implement policies and procedures. You're going to audit yourself. You're going to keep an eye on record keeping. But what do you need to know about violations? What's the difference between what happens when you find something internally versus somebody external comes in, regulators of any particular authority come in and see it? If you are doing regular internal audits, that's going to prevent you from anything escalating to the external. So you want to make sure you're on top of that. Some of the hot button issues that we're seeing right now for enforcement actions are around security, prevention of diversion, product liability, whether that's ingredients, testing, packaging and labeling, different issues with the products that are eventually reach consumers. And of course, if there's a threat to public safety, that usually rises to the level of an enforcement action. So the key takeaways for compliance in the cannabis industry are creating that culture of compliance, like I talked about, from the ground up, empowering your team. Stay consistent on different legal requirements, staying vigilant and regarding a shifting industry and regulatory standards. What we're seeing now in mature markets is there's, of course, cannabis regulations, but those regulatory authorities are now looking deeper into the regulations and pulling in some of the requirements related to OSHA, food safety, workplace safety. And COVID-19 has certainly highlighted that and put a lot more focus on workplace safety, environmental safety, and there has been recent, enforcement action in numerous states regarding the environmental category as well. So you definitely want to be on top of those enforcement priorities.
Thanks, Casey. And before Adam jumps on, I guess speaking of enforcement actions, for those who've tuned into previous webinars, apologies, it's going to be slightly redundant, but it's worth driving the point home. You know, in EH&S, this is no longer a theoretical risk to cannabis facilities. There's actual live enforcement going on. You know, we can talk about why it's your responsibility, your duty to comply with all the various aspects of these laws, but, you know, for some operators, it's a theoretical risk until it isn't. And just to highlight a couple, you know, relatively recent enforcement actions from across the country, you know, a cannabis processing firm and managers pled guilty in the sense of criminal charges related to the illegal transportation of hazardous waste. That actually was, Adam will highlight all the various agencies, but Environmental Protection Agency with the Department of Justice. So this is federal environmental agency getting involved in a cannabis operation. You know, federal government relatively hands off when it comes to cannabis, not so in terms of environmental regulators. So a San Diego company was extracting oils from cannabis. They were generating various hazardous wastes, including 55-gallon drums, a federally regulated hazardous waste, ethanol in particular. And so part of their plea agreement, not only did they have to pay, you know, hundreds of thousands of dollars in fine, but, you know, potentially facing, you know, criminal sanctions and years in prison. And those, a lot of these are per day violations when we're talking about violating federal law. Bringing it home to Massachusetts, where we have an office, a cannabis operator was fined $18,000 over air emissions and hazardous waste issues. And this was just kind of during a routine inspection. And then a local hemp processor, again, fined over $800,000 for willful safety violations. This is related to OSHA violations. They're operating out of a condemned facility. Workers were living there. This is related to processing and packaging hemp. OSHA issued citations of $165,000 each of the 5 employers. So per employer violations. And then, you know, our typical other, you know, illegal cannabis grow violations, but just highlighting, you know, this is not theoretical anymore. This is active, this is live, and we're seeing an uptick of these enforcement efforts across the country. So, you know, with that scary in mind, turning it to Adam to talk about, you know, how cannabis facilities could get up and running and into compliance, so they're not dinged.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I appreciate Casey and Michelle. Appreciate being here today to speak to you and to share a little bit of the world that I'm involved with. So walk through a few sort of stories around auditing and give folks a feel for maybe the differences that can take place between an audit and an inspection. Next, please. I just wanted to not spend much time, but just give you folks a feel of who Ensafe is. We have branches across the country. We're primarily a big focus of our footprint is Southeast, but we're a national firm. So we're California based also, and quite a few offices continue. The kind of things, you know, we get involved with is broad range as far as health and safety, as far as we do some design work. We assist folks with natural resource protection. We've done some work in the drinking water space, environmental management and restoration technology. So it's been it is a fairly broad range of client needs and client deliverables in the environmental health and safety space. To give you just another last piece of this with a little bit of Ensafe background is the kind of clients we have. And actually this slide, and I noticed this previous, but there was the slide that I was working with. We also do quite a bit of work, you know, as you can see from some of these names and some that aren't on the sheet, you know, they're highly regulated type workspace. We do quite a bit of work in the distilled spirits space. We support actually Jack Daniels and several of the other large distilled spirits in the Southeast. We've done work for Coca-Cola. I've done work for ESPN, for example. So it's quite a broad range. A lot of work, though, is in industrial clients, and we do quite a bit of support in aerospace and varied manufacturing. Next. So I wanted to share with the team here, with the folks on the call, some of my experience around health and safety auditings. And, one of the jokes that starts any audit is, the plant manager or whoever has welcomed the audit team says, I welcome the audit team this morning. That's sort of the opening line. But the audit does serve to provide useful information. As much as they can be challenging, and it's a time commitment and a cost commitment, they really can provide some useful insight at a facility who participates and decides to participate with an audit. Next. As everyone, I think, is aware, EH&S, environmental health and safety regulations, are complicated and voluminous, and in fact, very difficult to fully understand all of the regulations. And the good news here, though, is that for almost all facilities, not every regulation is applicable, and in fact, many are not. And that an audit actually can serve to help you understand, which regulations are applicable to you. That's another value of an audit. And you can see some of these regulations. Occupational Health and Safety Administration, environmental on the federal side. We have environmental on the state side, Mass DEP, for example. We do a lot of work with state agencies, and in many states, the state agency is primary versus federal. We do a lot of work in air quality, and you can see, some of these, industrial hygiene. But understanding your risks and requirements is really a key element. I almost call it environmental 101, understanding, what's applicable at your facility. And that's the starting point to understand what you need to be doing to be in compliance. Next. On the environmental regulatory side of scope, these are some of the things, we typically look at when we perform an audit at a facility. And you can sort of see some of the ones you would expect to see there. Is the facility producing any hazardous waste? I mean, we just heard an example of mismanagement of federally regulated hazardous waste. Is the facility have a water discharge? Is that discharge regulated? If so, is the facility in compliance with those regulations? Are they generating, for instance, something that they're sending down to the sanitary sewer, which may or may not be permitted? Do they have air emissions? Are they working with solvents? Do they have a combustion source? Are they running an emergency generator, for example? Chemical handling, refrigerant handling, all of these types of issues we've come across, and we typically look at during a environmental audit. Next. On the health and safety side, this is where we're looking at the OSHA type requirements. So you can look up the OSHA industry standards, OSHA 10, but many of these types of standards are very, very common. They're common to multiple industries, and folks clearly, have powered industrial vehicles, both propane, they can be electric. Are they dealing with proper hazard communication? Are they notifying their employees of the hazards associated with the materials that they're working with? That's an OSHA federal standard. PPE, it's one thing to say, yeah, we're handing out gloves, we're handing out eye protection. That's fine, but have you done a PPE assessment? Do you understand what your risks are, and then therefore you're making the proper selection of that PPE? That's a requirement to the PPE program. There's various, for example, all sorts of different gloves. If you're working with certain solvents, you can choose the wrong glove that would not be protective against that solvent, for example. Fire protection. We have a bunch of folks who can do deep dives on fire protection, but even basic flammable storage, the NFPA 30 requirements, You can see machine guarding and lockout, working with moving mechanical equipment, electrical safety, the use of, for instance, extension cords, things of that nature, which might seem okay in the home space, but are not okay in an industrial space. Respiratory protection, egress, access, exits, etc. Next. You skipped one, yes. So I wanted to just share with folks today, just to give a feel for the kind of OSHA common violations that they see, and just so folks might understand, OSHA does not typically show up at a facility, but with that said, they will show up in the event of an issue, an injury, God forbid, an amputation or fatality. They certainly will show up if someone is making a complaint. If they get a call that they should show up, they often do. And these are the kind of things that they see. I mentioned the hazard communication, PPE, eye protection. These are all the similar kinds of things that OSHA will cite. And lack of understanding of the requirement or lack of understanding of the regulation is not adequate to protect you from an OSHA violation. And if it's a willful or serious violation, then that can follow with potentially significant penalties. Next. So I think it's obvious, but I wanted to share, why would you want to perform an EH&S audit? And as we've already heard a little bit this morning, folks sort of audit every day. They walk around the plant, they're comfortable with what they're seeing, but an audit is a more formal review. It's done by a third-party expert, typically, where they're coming in with a fresh set of eyes. They've never been in your facility, and they're bringing their experience with them. So what you might feel is okay or acceptable may or may not be. And as I've already indicated, understanding those applicable requirements. What is applicable at your facility? If you don't have an air emission source, then we don't have to drill down too far in air emissions requirements, for example. But if we're generating waste, we certainly need to look at that. The audit can help you identify opportunities to improve, so we can prioritize findings. We can say, hey, we have 6 or 8 findings here, but these 2 findings, for example, are really worth you spending the time to get correct. It allows you to come into compliance, so we can discover things, we can protect that discovery, we can work under attorney-client privilege if required, and it can help you come into compliance. It can protect your workers, obviously, your brand image, and certainly avoid regulatory interactions, fines and penalties. You're sort of making sure you're in compliance before an inspector gets there, save time and money. And again, I always like to say that these types of issues, EH&S, should be viewed as a normal part of doing business. This is not some special extra work that needs to take place. All operations should be aware and be in compliance with their EH&S as a normal part of doing business. One of the things we see and we share with folks, and I'll use the word permits or approvals or your operating licensure, understanding what are your requirements. Make sure you read your permits and approvals. What does it say? If you have an air permit, what are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? What kind of records do you need to maintain? What kind of reports do you need to file? Understanding your standard industry code. These are, how you're classified. And when we do auditing and we look at programs individually, so we're going to make sure that we're looking at programs. We're going to drill down air, we're going to drill down water, waste management, etc. The community right to know, EPRA, we're actually doing a lot of work this month. A lot of those reports are due March 1st. Many facilities can have EPRA reporting requirements just because they trigger storage of certain chemistry on site. And I can tell you that they certainly are looking at those reports and looking at facilities that are not filing those reports, for example, as a reason to take a visit to a facility. Next. So, knowing is half the battle. understanding what's applicable from the environmental side, understanding what's applicable from the OSHA side. You may have, as we've already discussed, standard work practices, corporate procedures. So are you in compliance with those internal documents or other standards, external program requirements? And again, treating this as more than just checking the box. Very often, folks will walk around and do daily inspections. I see this regularly. They check a box, they've looked at something, it's part of their daily check. But an audit is a much deeper dive than just checking the box. I wanted to give a share on the kinds of experiences you might see during an audit. And I'm going to sort of use the word audit, meaning this is something that you've decided to do preemptive. And I'll use the word inspection. When I use that word, I'm sort of more talking about when a regulatory inspector comes on the property, which is not necessarily planned or scheduled. So we'll look at some pre-audit preparation during the audit, and then some common audit findings and closeouts and things that sort of happen during an audit or inspection. Next. So, why am I getting audited? Why is there a knock at the door, so to speak? Well, a regulatory agency inspection can be triggered by all sorts of things. As I said, if a facility should be filing something annually and they don't, then that can often trigger an inspection. They can even possibly guess what types of facilities should be making certain types of filings. You could have a surprise agency inspection. Maybe there's been a complaint, maybe there's an odor, there's a noise, there's an injury, a neighbor is called, random. Maybe an employee has made a call to a regulatory inspection agency or former employee. We've seen all sorts of things of that nature. Or you've made a filing on one regulatory program that triggers another regulatory program to take a look. And I think this is something to think about as we become a more mature industry. We have one type of inspector in the plant and he says, wow, I was in the plant looking for A, B, and C, but I noticed also the following things that didn't look quite right to me. We should get a separate inspector out there to look at that. We spoke a little bit about internal requirements. We have clients who want to do these regularly. They want to do them annually. Maybe they want to do them every couple of years. They want to typically have a third-party review versus an internal. These are done to maintain certifications. They're often done as a result of a merger or an acquisition with a new owner. So a new owner wants to understand the compliance history of a facility. And if this facility has compliance issues, they might want to know that prior to a merger or acquisition, for example. Next. Okay. So as we were saying, the audits can be helpful. You can really use them to your advantage. They can help you highlight concerns or issues that need to have visibility to plant management, need to have visibility. Maybe they even need funding to make repairs or improvements. Maybe you need to purchase some pollution control device or secondary containment or make other changes in the operation, maybe the way you handle the waste. And again, so I wouldn't view these as adversarial or daunting, but rather, a good tool for improvement. And, these really can help. Next. So another reason I think that is helpful when you're getting audited and preparing for an audit is it also is preparing you for the potential if you truly did get a regulatory inspection. It shows you that you're ready to be audited and the kinds of things that you might expect, that would take place during an audit, to have accessibility to files and records. We often see things now, obviously they're not all hard copies, so you might have to have access to a network drive or other electronic documentation. How organized is the documentation? This is a key element. I can't tell you how many times we've been around facilities and assisted facilities just becoming more organized. They have documents, but they're not organized, or they're just literally put into one folder, environmental safety folder, and that really is not adequate for organization. And a regulator, I can tell you, when they see someone who's fumbling and cannot easily retrieve documents and cannot easily retrieve records, that's a red flag for them. The same on the reverse side. If they see someone who's organized, they see someone who's not fumbling, they see someone who, when they're asked for a document, can retrieve it, they're much more comfortable. So keeping those records, keeping proof of submittals, if you've made a report, keeping proof that you've made that submittal, and having that backup and documentation backup is really important, and not just for an audit. Next. So I put here that this could take place certainly during an audit and or inspection, but to give folks, especially, you know, if you're thinking about what a regulatory inspection might be compared to an audit being obviously a much friendlier situation, but be calm, be courteous. If a regulatory inspector shows up at a facility, inform appropriate personnel. I remember a story where we had a regulatory inspector sit at the guard booth for 45 minutes because we had a security person not make a proper call, and that does not make for a happy inspector. I can tell you right now that that's a big no-go right from the beginning. Make sure you have the appropriate personnel at these audit closings and meetings. Answer questions honestly, truthfully, stick to the question. You know, don't necessarily keep going on and on. If an auditor or a regulator has asked you a question, answer that question, but don't keep sharing information. You know, be transparent, try to understand findings before an auditor leaves. And again, repetitively, we're using these internal audits, these non-regulatory inspections as a learning tool. Take notes, dig into operations, and you're going to get hopefully a roadmap that helps you prioritize and work on things that need to be worked on. Next. So I may be stating the obvious here, but it's worth at least going over this. You know, don't try to create or hide information at the time of an audit. If you were supposed to be inspecting something and the auditor is asking for those inspection records and you don't have them, well, then that's the answer. You don't have them. You're not creating them at the time of the inspection or the audit. That's not a good idea. You can say, I don't know, find out. Those are perfectly good responses. You know, answer if you have the information, but again, saying I don't know or I'll find out is okay also. And, you know, don't jump to conclusions what the auditor or inspector is asking for. They have often, inspectors typically, including auditors, we use auditing checklists. We have all sorts of forms and tools that we use. We actually have state regulatory tools. So if I'm going into a facility in New York versus Massachusetts versus Vermont versus California, we're using separate auditing tools that are state specific. So they're just trying to gather the information. The question may not be highly relevant, but he's walking through the auditing process. Next. So what happens during a typical audit? Well, a typical audit includes an opening and closing meeting. We often introduce the team. We'll explain why we're there. I'll get a little more involved with what a closing meeting looks like. Obviously, it's going to involve a site inspection, a walk around. When we do environmental auditing, we certainly look at outside the facility. We often go on the roof. We obviously are going to be looking inside the facility. We're going to be looking at process operations, storage operations, where chemistry is being used, where machinery is being operated. We're going to look at maintenance operations. So I might have a small maintenance facility or maintenance op that is sort of separate in a back room, but they are kind of not too pretty to look at, and we might find some findings in there. We're going to look at records. So as I've already stated, these records are important to demonstrate compliance. In fact, they're very important to demonstrate compliance. They're often the things that are most scrutinized during audits. So do you have waste manifests? Do you have the reports that you should have been filing? We're going to potentially talk to employees. So we might speak to someone on the floor. We might say, hey, you're working with this chemical. Have you ever been trained? I see you're doing this. Do you have you had any understanding of the kind of protection you should be using for this operation? We may talk to maintenance. We may talk to human resources to understand what kind of training has taken place. Do we have training records? Has people logged into a PowerPoint? I mean, what are the training methods and or records associated with that training? Next. Things to consider. This is certainly something you might want to consider pre-audit, but certainly during the audit. You know, obviously we talked about the facility tour. If you conduct a normal safety briefing, then certainly do the safety briefing with the auditor or inspector. If an auditor or inspector asks to access a certain area and they don't have the proper PPE, if they're not wearing steel-toed shoes, if that's required, or hearing protection, if that's required, then obviously they need to have that. They can't, just because they're the auditor, they can't circumvent the safety requirements. If they're going to take photographs, you can discuss that ahead of time. You may or may not want to approve that. If a regulator is taking photographs, then I would plan on taking the exact same photographs and making notes as to what photographs the regulator took, or you can even provide the photographs for the regulator or inspector and say, we are not going to allow you to take your own photographs, but we can provide those photographs. Identify a logical route. Doesn't mean they have to, literally just freewheeling crawl into every square foot of the facility. If you're going to do document review, let's set up so we are fairly close to the documents. Hopefully those documents are in the same building. Maybe an auditor or inspector wants internet access. Again, if we're going to have a meeting. And I put a little note on the bottom of this slide, if this is truly an agency inspection, you really want to manage these logistics and information flow carefully. For instance, I've seen where, we know an inspector is in the building and they're letting this inspector wander into offices. They're letting this inspector file through a file cabinet. Those are all bad practices. If an auditor or inspector asks to see waste records, then you go and get those records and bring them to the auditor. You don't let, and you make sure you're looking at what you're about to hand the auditor. You don't just let the auditor walk through files or documents without control. So now you've gone through the audit, and sometimes we do multi-day audits. The regulatory inspections can be multi-day, or sometimes they're one day. So at the end, we're going to have a debrief. So the goal here is that we don't want surprises at the end of the audit. We want to understand what those findings are. I mentioned the word daily informal debriefs. In the event of a multi-day audit, we often have informal debriefs. The plant manager or our senior folks want to hear, what we find, what are we planning for the next day. Maybe there's a misunderstanding with our finding. Maybe there's an error of fact. I thought I saw something. I thought I understood something, but maybe I didn't really. Maybe there are records or data that if I had seen or touched, I would have a different understanding of what I'm looking at. And, have people who are involved with the area present as needed, and we can openly discuss potential findings so that we can potentially agree to disagree, but we can at least discuss what those potential findings are. And in a similar vein, if we're having now a closing meeting, the auditor is going to provide a clear summary or detailed list of findings. We often do follow up with a written. We like to use different formats. Sometimes it's just as simple as an Excel table with our findings, and we can present those findings. Sometimes there's a delay of a couple of weeks to fully get together our finalized detailed list. But certainly, even at the time of closeout of the audit itself, we have a general understanding of what those findings are. You can ask questions about the findings before the auditors leave. This isn't necessarily an argument between, disagreeing with the findings. It's more of a, we possibly will have some future discussion, but we're just trying to understand the findings. And again, I put a note here at the bottom. Don't let an agency inspector leave the building without some clear summary as to what he saw and what next steps would be. So it's absolutely okay to say to the inspector, okay, you were here today. Do you have any findings? Have you identified any potential non-compliance? Are there things that you want further follow-up? And what would be next steps? Am I going to expect to see an inspection report from you? Am I going to get some sort of a closure letter? What is the timing of these next steps? It's important because obviously once they're gone, they're gone, and you can't ask additional questions. Next. As I already indicated, we typically do a report table. We try to keep it kind of simple, but we are going to summarize findings. We're going to give a regulatory citation associated with the findings. We're going to probably give you some potential for risk ranking or prioritization. Maybe there's an upload document to a corporate or internal tracking system. Many of our clients are large clients. They have multiple facilities, so they want to internally track findings for multiple facilities. We would often identify responsible parties and corrective actions. So If something needs to be fixed, we would identify or jointly agree who the responsible party is, what those corrective actions might look like. We might dictate a time to closure. Maybe it's 30 days, maybe it's 60 days, maybe it's 90 days, depending on the nature of the finding, depending on how significant the finding would be to obviously bring to closure. We can have a follow-up call. We often do that. We'll have follow-up calls with folks if they want to discuss findings or discuss their progress towards closure of a finding. Next. So that's, you know, what I wanted to share. Again, we're in a space where we're seeing, you know, mature industries, but I can tell you from experience that these regulatory interactions can be significant, and they really can be very time consuming and costly. It's not just the potential for being fined, it's the effort level required to respond to a finding, to possibly show documentation towards a finding. And so I can tell you from direct experience, there's can be a lot of involvement regarding an environmental regulatory or OSHA regulatory interaction.
Great, appreciate that. Casey, if I can ask you to hop back on screen. I know there's a few questions coming in the chat, but I was hoping to kind of touch on a few questions, you know, I have that we've been talking about generally. I guess, you know, to kick things off, you know, we're talking about cannabis, we're talking about EHS, we're talking about, you know, a bunch of different agencies here. You know, I guess maybe asking Casey to start, is there a chance you're going to get a double whammy? Is there a chance a state or federal environmental agency is going to come after you for some, you know, a record keeping violation that Adam highlighted, but then the cannabis agency is going to tack on because potentially that also violates some, you know, truth or disclosure or anything like that? Is there a chance, you know, you'll get double hit in this space?
Yeah, I think of course there is. It depends on the state's regulations. It may be more explicit in some regulations than others. But in Massachusetts, for example, there is a specific requirement that you have policies and procedures that comply with the standards of OSHA. So should OSHA come after you for any reason, there is no reason why in Massachusetts the Cannabis Control Commission can't also come after you for a violation of non-compliance with the standards of OSHA. With the environmental protection, you know, again, there's a lot of blanket language and regulations that says, you know, compliance with applicable state and local agencies and their and applicable regulations. So I do believe there is nothing that would prevent the Cannabis Control Commission in Massachusetts or another regulatory agency to tack on. It may be something that during the enforcement proceedings may alleviate some of the penalties or act as a mitigating factor. But again, I don't see that would prevent a regulatory agency from also adding a little bit of hurt on there as well.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would add, you know, you mentioned about the solvent example. That's a perfect example. I mean, if I'm the state has waste inspector, I don't really care what other regulations you're in compliance with. I'm looking at this has waste violation that to me is directly in my wheelhouse. You know, you are handling solvent, it's being improperly handled, it's federal hazardous waste, you haven't done characterization, you're not having a proper manifest, you're not properly disposing of it. You know, that's completely in the wheelhouse.
That's game over.
Well, it's certainly a violation. It's not a gray area. And as I indicated, we know and we've seen one regulator might come in doing their regulatory work, but if they see things that make them uncomfortable, they know people, they know who else to call. They say, gee, I was just out at facility X for an air inspection, but they got a back room there that I want to get one of our waste guys out there. It looked terrible to me. And that's exactly what happens.
Yeah, you never know who's friends with whom, what agency, who goes out for beers, I guess when we were all going out for beers at night, so.
Right, and even you mentioned enforcement priorities, where the concept of one facility has, I use the example of, unfortunately, an explosion, for example, or a fire, for example, or someone gets, there's an exposure due to a certain type of chemical. Then many states will respond by, let's look at the industries that use that kind of chemical that are in similar, you know, who probably have the same risk in their facility, and let's go audit them. So something happening at another facility could directly trigger a facility inspection at your facility.
So we're all in this together. Let's learn together and be compliant together. And I guess Along the same line, you mentioned, if possible, don't let a regulator leave your site without having some type of summary or findings or some type of, indication of which way this is going. Any advice? And Casey, same for you and your experience. What happens if a state or federal official says, oh, I have to look into it, or I'm not ready to commit, or, they hedge and dodge in person? How far do you think an operator should push it looking for, what the indication is or what next steps, or better just back off, let it lie, and wait to see what shoe will drop? Maybe Adam, you first.
Well, certainly, I can't, a regulator can state whatever they want to state, and they can say, we're not ready to summarize our findings. I have to go back and talk to my team. But I can certainly say, well, okay, but when can I expect to hear from you? Am I going to hear from you in a week or 2 weeks? Am I, I would at least put them on the spot to some extent to say, okay, what is the next steps for sure? When am I going to hear from you? What is the schedule? And did you see anything significant, right off the bat? I mean, I think that's a fair question. Whether or not they can exactly answer that they have findings or not, maybe they can't, but they certainly, I think, should be able to answer in general, a general statement of what they're taking away, because they certainly take notes and they're using checklists.
Sure. Casey, anything to add?
Yeah, and from the cannabis regulatory side, I think it's really important to, again, have that debrief, have that conversation, because there is a lot of confusion, I think, when you're speaking to a regulator, especially if they start asking, different agents at your facility certain questions, like pop-up interviews of somebody who's just, a trimmer, somebody who's just day-to-day work. They could be contemplating a violation that maybe the person had misspoke about a particular process, or quite frankly, it really isn't something that's in their wheelhouse or that they have a, deep knowledge of. And what you want to do is take that chance to address those issues. There's also some findings that are so insignificant and small that they can be alleviated right away, and fixed right away. And at least in my experience, once they leave, and Adam had kind of led to this as well, once they leave, that's it. There's not really, and in Massachusetts, once it's written down on a, notice of violation, you don't have that opportunity to say, whoa, I kind of disagree here with your interpretation here. You don't get that chance. So to have that during the debrief is so important. Of course, you can't, trap them into it. You have to kind of listen and, follow what they're getting at if they're not willing to have any additional conversation. If they're just saying, listen, I need to look into this a little bit more, I'll get back to you. Sometimes that's where it has to be left. I do think it's important to have an understanding of what you should expect for communication and feeling comfortable to follow up with that, because to the extent that there is a public safety or it's a violation that, potentially is ongoing while you wait for a determination, you want to make sure you're making swift action to resolve that.
Right, and even something, correct contact information, business cards, understanding exactly which agency is in the facility. I've seen even that confused, a statement of, well, the EPA was here. Well, no, it wasn't the EPA, it was the state regulator. That's not the same thing. Okay, that's not the same thing. So understanding who visited you, and again, when am I going to hear? What is going to be the method of communication for next steps? Typically, an NOV or even things of that nature potentially can still have further discussion. But as Casey just said, once they're issuing a speeding ticket, once the police officer has said, I've seen you doing 80, here's your ticket, the interaction is mostly over with.
Sure. All right. Those are good tips. And I guess speaking of tips, you had mentioned, the format, the style of the findings in Excel, or, potentially a written document. I guess how, once a company gets the audit findings, is that it? Good luck to you, sir. I hope you implement, or, are we here? Are we available to help coach through how to come into compliance and, build out those programs? I guess how has this worked for other companies once they get, your internal findings? Again, starting with you, Adam.
Well, certainly as a consultant, an audit can lead to additional follow-on work, and often does. So we have a finding of an SOP is not in place, or a certain filing has not taken place, or they don't have an adequate error record keeping system. So those are all things that we can provide. We can give proposals for further follow-on work. I think the best scenarios are often where a facility is going to do pieces of it themselves, and maybe there are some small pieces that we can and should assist with, but on simple things, they probably can close many of these simpler things themselves. So I think it's mixed, but yes, an audit can lead to additional follow-on work and identification of follow-on work that needs to be done.
Yeah, and similar to what Adam said, it really depends on, the client and the findings. Sometimes the findings, if it's issues with the way inventory is conducted, we will be very hands-on on helping clients reach compliance and developing a program that really works for them. Because there are certain regulatory requirements where, yes, this is what is compliant, but there are ways to reach compliance that are different based on the facility. And we do help, not only to identify how to correct and then follow up. We often work with clients that have regularly scheduled compliance audits. And what we see is that initial audit, that initial burst, it's usually the longest and it's got the most action items. Next quarter, it's a little bit less. Next quarter, less. And I expect to see that until there is possibly a changing regulation, a changing enforcement priority. And that's usually when we also start to say, like, okay, we've gotten to a good place when it comes to cannabis regulatory. This is where we start to really expand on what that means for other food safety, environmental health and safety, workplace safety, and make sure that the entire facility is at a level that is operating compliantly, not only on its face, but with record keeping and all the other regulatory considerations.
Right, and I just repeating this, it's it often is very front loaded. So, and it can seem scary and daunting that hey, you don't have any of these procedures in place. You don't have the proper OSHA programs for hearing protection, for example. But once the program is put in place, it becomes easier to maintain. The effort required for maintenance of an ongoing program is a lot less. So it's often very front loaded, where the initial work is much larger. And then as we come into compliance and have more mature programs that are established, maintenance of those programs takes less effort.
Great. And, along those same lines, a couple questions in the chat asking, where can companies go to look for these resources? I mean, obviously, Casey, Adam, you both have them at your disposal, but are there any free or low cost resources available? Is any industry association putting out these resources? Or is it really, they'd be best served to get the best and the brightest and go directly to, someone who's been in this space for a while? Or are there any freebies that are worthwhile for at least having something to start with?
Want to go, Casey? Or
Sure. Yeah, when it comes to like free guidance and certainly staying on top of enforcement priorities, your regulatory body and that website is probably the most important. Wherever they post bulletins and different guidance from the Cannabis Control Commission, other departments, that would be priority. There are also, in cannabis specifically, metric and other inventory tracking systems that are required by the state. They'll often release their own guidance bulletins. You always want to be checking there. And then, follow public meetings and conversations that are happening on the regulatory level to make sure you're aware of enforcement priorities and hot topics that have just, they're kind of continuing to come up over and over again. That's likely the direction we're leading. And most importantly, stay on top of the news, because like Adam had mentioned, something could happen in one state that's going to trigger changes in another state, like the vape crisis. So you do want to be aware just generally of news and enforcement and across the nation in cannabis, as well as what's going on in your own state.
right, and I would say, many states, in fact, almost all, they have pretty good, and they've gotten better, state environmental websites. And they often have how-tos, if I'm generating hazardous waste, how to, and they'll have guidance documents. All of this is free. The EPA documents are free. I mean, one of the challenges, I think, in the environmental health and safety space is that it can be a little overwhelming and it can be a little sort of scary, and folks don't know sort of where to start. But a lot of those, OSHA has if there's free training you can download on some of the standard OSHA programs. So there are free documents out there. There are tools you can use to review and understand some of the requirements. You can make phone calls. I would be careful when you call regulators. We've seen that backfire, but there are sources as well as subscription sources for environmental type reviews that people subscribe to, and they can get a push feed, every week or every month, or depending on what they're subscribing to.
Great. And I know some of the trade groups, put out the free posters, to display, worker safety and other things. So there are, if you dig, some decent guidance out there, but sometimes it is what you pay for. So the free ones might not necessarily be your industry specific, your operation, your state, but as Adam said, if you do a little bit of the legwork, there could be opportunities there. All right, we've got a couple minutes left. I guess if I can just do lightning round, Adam and Casey, I guess one last piece of advice that you'd offer to operators in this space. I guess what is one, hot button issue you see? I think Casey touched on some enforcement, but is there anything trending right now in your day-to-day practice that, for all those people listening, you'd just like to, put shine a light on and really highlight for those in the audience?
I don't know that there's one item I would like to highlight, but I just do.
I take two. I take three.
And as I said a couple times, understanding, what it is in your facility that then triggers a regulatory requirement. And if you don't even have the basics of what that is, then it's very difficult to even get started. So that is the value of at least even inventorying your own facility and looking around to understand, we are working with this types of flammables, so that there's probably requirements there, or we have folks that are wearing PPE, there's requirements there, or we have a machine guarding issue. I mean, I think that's the way you need to start to think about this, that you just can't assume that what we're doing is okay in that space. And certainly anything that would involve safety of employees, someone getting hurt, injuries, someone needing first aid or beyond first aid, those are things that are typically, can be real red flags.
Yeah, and mine isn't really necessarily one particular category. Like, I'm not going to say security is a hot button item. It's really documentation, because you can explain how you're in compliance with the regulations or how you have a particular SOP in place. But if you don't have the documentation to back that up, like for just a quick example, if you have a requirement to do temperature and humidity control, and you say, yeah, I check the temperature all the time in here, it's at the right temperature. Then say, okay, yeah, where's the document?
Show me.
Did you log it? Yeah, show me.
Show and tell.
Exactly.
Not
you gotta
just
have
tell.
a lot of it, they'll say, oh, I noticed your camera's out. When's the last time you checked it? It's like, oh, we check these every day. Really? Prove it. Sanitation, same thing. These facilities are getting older. They're used more. There is a requirement to maintain, washable ceilings, walls, and floors. Did you clean that floor yesterday? Because I can't tell. And they'd be like, yeah, actually I did. See, this is the person who did it. This is the time they did it. So generally speaking, being able to close the loop with documentation is such a huge part of compliance right now.
Right.
And generally, all the time.
All right. Well, I think we're coming up on time. For those in attendance, we're going to be sending out some these PowerPoint afterwards, as well as recording. If you want to, watch this over and over again, have all your friends together, pop some popcorn, really just dig in to our beautiful faces. This will be sent out. We'll also include our contact information. If anyone thinks of any other questions, would like to reach out, have a conversation. This is one in a series for those that have been following along. So in terms of other resources that are available, stay tuned for the next webinar from us at VS and the EHS practice group. We'll be launching more and more content to try to help educate and work through all the cannabis compliance and EH&S compliance requirements. So really appreciate everyone's time. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Ensafe. And thank you, Casey, for participating. Really appreciate all of your time today.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for attending today.
Bye, everyone.